Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world that you're joining us from. My name is Mande Muyangwa, and I'm the director of the Wilson Center Africa Program, and welcome to this inaugural biannual lecture and dialogue of the Brown Capital Management Forum on Africa. I would like to introduce my boss, Ambassador Mark Green, the Wilson Center's new president, director, and CEO, who will open today's event. Ambassador Green probably needs no introduction. He has a long and distinguished career in public service, and he previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from 2007 to 2009, and most recently, he served as Administrator of USAID. Ambassador Green, welcome, and please get us started.
Thank you, Monday, and good morning to everyone, and welcome here joining us, whether you're doing so in person or online. We are truly excited and honored to bring you this lecture from the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, live from the Wilson Center Auditorium. And as someone who has had the pleasure and privilege of living on the African continent a couple of times in my life, I can tell you that nobody is more excited than I am, because quite frankly, I believe in Africa, and I believe in Africa's bright future. Very quickly, a little bit about the Wilson Center for those of you who are not familiar with us. We're unlike other think tanks and policy centers. We were established by Congress some 5 decades ago with the mission, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. And while others deal in data and information, we've been directed to go much further. Our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations that decision makers can believe in. We are fiercely nonpartisan and independent, and we are dedicated to finding answers for today's most important foreign policy challenges, questions, and opportunities, and that really is why we are so honored to host this forum today with our keynote speaker, Wamkele Mene, Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. In addition to His Excellency, we're also honored to host Ms. Dana Banks, Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Africa at the NSC, Her Excellency Hilda Suka-Mafudze, the African Union Ambassador to the United States, as well as other U.S. government officials, members of the Africa Program Advisory Council, and especially our partners at Brown Capital Management, particularly Mr. Eddie Brown and Mr. Keith Lee, who are joining us here today in person. The support from Brown Capital Management allows the Wilson Center to focus on development in Africa and U.S.-Africa economic relations. Today's event marks the inaugural biennial lecture and dialogue of the Africa program of Brown Capital Management, which, needless to say, would not have been possible without their generous support and, quite frankly, their dedication to Africa's future. Since its launch in 2015, this forum has provided a long overdue substantive platform for talking about solution and solution-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and U.S.-Africa relations overall. There are few topics more important to realizing Africa's potential and to strengthening U.S.-Africa partnerships than what brings us all here today: African Continental Free Trade Area and its possibilities are absolutely crucial to the continent's future. After a COVID-driven postponement, trading under this trade area commenced on January 1st, 2021. To the casual observer, that commencement probably looked like the flip of a light switch. Not so much. It was, of course, years in the making and the product of much leadership and hard work. While implementation is ongoing, the free trade area is poised to transform Africa into the largest free trade area in the world. The aim is simple: to improve trade and commerce with and within Africa. It helps to facilitate the movement of people, goods, and capital. It prevents entrepreneurship and opportunity from being stopped at the border. It pulls vibrant communities together into even more vibrant markets. What does that actually mean for the African people? The chance to translate dreams into products, jobs into careers, and African innovations into a more vibrant world. The free trade area will increase the competitiveness and resilience of African markets. Connecting a market of over 1.2 billion people with combined GDP of $3.4 trillion, not only to each other, but to the rest of the world. It will promote development that is economically, environmentally, and socially responsible and resilient. In short, according to a World Bank study, this free trade area has the potential to lift nearly 30 million people out of poverty. But again, the dream of this free trade area is not merely Africa's. A stronger, more developed, and more connected African marketplace presents opportunities for the U.S. to improve its trade and investment relationship with Africa, especially in technology and other high-value sectors. Trade is good for the U.S. More than 90% of the world's consumers live outside our border. As I often tell people, where I come from, the Midwest, my former constituents, so many of them farmers, would always say, if we can't trade, if we can't export, we might as well plow under our fields. How this free trade area integrates with existing U.S. programs such as Prosper Africa and AGOA will be crucial in shaping the future of U.S.-African trade and development. That's the work ahead for leaders from the public and private sectors. And that's, again, what makes today's dialogue with the Secretary General so interesting and so important. But before we get underway, let me call on someone who cares passionately about this subject and what enhanced U.S.-Africa trade and commerce can mean. I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Eddie Brown, founder, chairman, and CEO of Brown Capital Management, to offer his own words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Green. I'm founder, chairman, CEO of Brown Capital Management. We are an investment management firm based in Baltimore, Maryland. I think this is a great day. I'd also like to thank the virtual audience. I understand it's every country represented on the continent. Thank you for coming, for tuning in. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Wilson Center Africa Program for their support in organizing and hosting today's event. As Ambassador Green mentioned, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum is a platform for substantive, policy-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. Africa does not get nearly the attention that it deserves. And all too often, that attention does not gets focused on its challenges. We at Brown Capital are proud to support and partner with the Wilson Center to shine a spotlight on Africa's development, the challenges, as well as the opportunities, and the potential for stronger and mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa economic engagement. Over the past 6 years, it doesn't seem like that long, Monday, past 6 years, we have hosted with the Wilson Center 16 events focused on the foremost issues facing Africa and U.S. economic relations. From hosting a high-level meeting on sovereign wealth funds on the continent, discussing U.S.-Africa economic relationships at the state level, to unpacking the drivers of Africa's ongoing transformation and examining the role of the business sector in African peace building, to exploring implications of changing global trade and the architecturals of supply chain challenges, to assessing the ways to maximize the participation of women in economic leadership. The Africa Forum has continued to be a crucial platform for bringing together key policymakers, practitioners, private sector representatives, and experts to find actionable solutions to bolster substantial development and build mutually beneficial trade and investment relations between Africa and the United States. The topic of today's event, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is a fitting one to begin the next chapter of our partnership with the Wilson Center. The Africa Forum and the biennial lecture and dialogue series as the promising opportunities for growth under AfCFTA make it more important than ever to facilitate open, honest, and fruitful engagement and dialogue between key African and U.S. economic stakeholders and policymakers. And what better person to offer insights, reflections, and recommendations on how Africa and the United States can engage to support the AfCFTA than His Excellency Juan Kel A. Minye, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. I look forward to today's important lecture and dialogue and want to thank all once again for joining us today and for your support for the Brown Capital Africa Forum. I would now like to turn proceedings over to Monde Muyangwa, Director of the Africa Program, who will introduce our special guest and moderate this event. Monde?
Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. And I would like to join Ambassador Green and Mr. Brown in welcoming all of you to this event and discussion this morning. For those of you following us on Twitter, you can follow live tweets of today's event on the Africa Program's Twitter account at AfricaUpClose, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag AfricaFreeTrade or hashtag AfricanTrade, all one word. As Ambassador Green mentioned, we have a lot of US and private sector representatives sitting in this auditorium today, including the Executive Office of the President at the White House, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the Bureau of African Affairs and the Office of Global Food Security at the US Department of State, the Bureau for Africa at USAID, and the Prosper Africa Initiative, the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the Small Business Administration, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Corporate Council on Africa, the US Business Center, as well as Ambassador Sukuma Futse, the African Union Ambassador to the United States. The participation and presence of these representatives at the forefront of the United States economic engagement with Africa speaks volumes as to the importance of today's lecture and dialogue. As has been mentioned by both Mr. Brown and Ambassador Green, we are focusing today's lecture on the African Continental Free Trade Area, which promises to transform Africa's economic development trajectory, the lives of millions of ordinary Africans, and center Africa in the global economic arena. Africa has been playing at the margins of global economic trade, and the Continental Free Trade Agreement really provides an opportunity to move Africa more centrally into that framework. So today's event will provide a status update on where the African Continental Free Trade Area stands, highlight some of the challenges in the road ahead, as well as the opportunities that it presents for Africa and her international partners to boost international trade while also fostering inclusive, sustainable development. And we will try to facilitate a meaningful, policy-oriented, and forward-looking dialogue. And Mr. Mene has promised me that he will do just that, so we are looking forward to that. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker to give the inaugural Brown Capital Management Lecture on Africa, His Excellency Wamkele Mene. Mr. Mene is a Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat based in Accra, Ghana. He was elected to this position by the 33rd Ordinary Session of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the African Union. He brings a wealth of experience to his current role. Prior to this, he served as Chief Director of Africa Economic Relations at the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa, and he was also South Africa's Chief Negotiator for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And from 2010 to 2015, he represented South Africa at the World Trade Organization. Mr. Mene also brings a lot of private sector experience, having worked for a variety of law firms in London and in Hong Kong. He holds a bachelor's degree in law from Rhodes University in South Africa, a master's in international studies and diplomacy from the School of Oriental Studies at the University of London, and a master's of laws degree in banking, law, and financial regulation from the London School of Economics. You can obtain his full bio on our website, but also in the event package and material that we have provided you. Obviously, this short introduction does not do justice to his credentials, but we do want to leave as much time for his lecture and for our engagement. And so I will now invite His Excellency to offer his remarks, after which we will open up the floor to questions from both our in-person and virtual audience. Without further delay, I invite you, Mr. Mene, to please take the podium.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muyangwa, for the warm welcome and introduction, to also Ambassador Green for his introductory remarks, to Mr. Eddie Brown, thank you, sir, for your vision in sponsoring this event, you and your senior executive leadership, the senior government officials that are here today, the government of the United States. I acknowledge your presence. Of course, our ambassador, African Union ambassador, Ambassador Suka Mafudze, ambassador to the US, and the senior executives that are here today. I must congratulate Dr. Muyangwa for her persuasiveness. At some point, I had decided that I will not travel because of the travel restrictions, and that I would, as a matter of protest, do this from Ghana. But she was able to persuade me to come. I'm very privileged to be here today. It is the very first official visit that I'm undertaking outside of the African continent since I was elected by heads of states last year in February. And this speaks to the commitment and the seriousness with which we view the relationship, the trade and investment relationship with the United States. The fact that the very first country outside of Africa that I have undertaken an official visit to is testament to the commitment that we have to a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that the vision of Brown Capital Management Africa is also an expression of that commitment. I would like to acknowledge the work that you are doing here at the Wilson Center, providing a high-level platform for African, US, and international business leaders, policymakers on advocacy and improving knowledge about Africa, as well as improving knowledge and providing very, very important market access information about mutually beneficial trade and investment relations between the continent of Africa and the United States. Africa is not about what one human being once described, and excuse my language, but Africa is not about what one human being described as shithole countries. There certainly is a great deal more to our continent than the perceptions that we sometimes see on mainstream media with a child who is hungry and has flies around her face. Those days of that continent are long gone. We now are a continent that before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic was growing at about 3.5% GDP. And of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world at that time, 6 were on the African continent. So certainly, we are nowhere near what this human being described to depict the image of our continent. I think more programs such as this, Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, are required to dispel this uninformed, ignorant, and quite frankly, astoundingly stupid stereotype about the African continent. An example of this astoundingly stupid stereotype about Africa is that the Omicron variant comes from South Africa and Botswana, which of course could not be further from the truth. What we should be doing as a global community is to congratulate Botswana and South Africa for deploying the best genome sequencing and detecting technologies to be able to tell the world of a new variant which had been doing its rounds, we now know, in Europe for at least the last 2 months, and yet we did not hear our colleagues in Europe tell the world that we have this variant. And so I would call, as I did, on the European government, I would call on the government here also to immediately reconsider the position to impose discriminatory travel restrictions on African countries. We know that there are less cases of Omicron detected in Malawi, in Zambia, in Mozambique, than there are in Belgium, in Germany, in Hong Kong, and various other countries around the world who have not been subject to the same discriminatory travel restrictions, which, in my view, under international trade law, are actually a violation of the values of an open trading system. They are a violation of the MFN treatment, of the WTO law, violation of these countries' economic rights and the right of these countries to engage in global commerce. And more importantly, they are, in my view, once again, they appear to be, based on what we've seen in some countries in Europe, they appear to be racially motivated. We have been depicted in cartoons, in Spanish newspapers as Africans, as disease carriers who are seeking refuge in other countries, bringing our disease. These despicable notions of Africa must stop. They must stop. On the contrary, we should be congratulating Botswana and South Africa, and we should be expressing global solidarity in the fight against this pandemic, instead of engaging in discriminatory and, in my view, sometimes racist stereotypes about the African continent. Why is the Secretary General of a free trade area talking like this about a public health issue? Well, it is simply because it has a direct impact on trade. Today, the countries that are subject to these restrictions have had their access to global supply chains disrupted. Today, the countries that are subjected to these discriminatory measures are not able to import life-saving drugs that they require to fight the pandemic. And we know from the position of the World Health Organization that travel restrictions do not work, that they are not based on science, they're not scientifically justified, and so there seems to be very little basis to continue with them. And so from a trade point of view, I'm very, very concerned about the impact of these restrictions. I'm very concerned about the right of these countries to engage in international trade and also to engage in global supply chains. Let me share with you 3 perspectives on the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, the state of play, the challenges that we will confront, and lastly, the opportunities for trade and investment between the United States and the African continent. Let me take a step back historically. You may well be aware that despite our continent's, and here I'm providing a critique, a self-critique of where we are as a continent and what our shortcomings have been for the last 60 years from a trade and investment point of view. Despite our enormous wealth in natural capital endowments, our economies remain among the least developed in the world. Africa has 17% of global population, but accounts for only 2% of global trade, 3% of global GDP, 2% of global manufacturing, and less than 2% of global direct foreign investment, mainly in the natural resource sector. Singapore, contribution of one country, an island, contribution to global trade and output is 6% and above. That means that combined, all 55 of us on the African continent are less globally competitive than Singapore. And so we have to confront this reality as Africans. We have to ask ourselves why in the last 60 to 65 years we remain in this condition of underdevelopment and underdeveloped productive and manufacturing and industrial base and industrial capacity to be able to be as globally competitive as China, India, Singapore, and other parts of the world. Only up to 18% of all trade on the continent occurs between African countries. We import excessively from the rest of the world. We manufacture exceedingly too little, and hence intra-Africa trade remains as low as it is. We know that Europe has, on average, 70% of intra-European trade. North America, intra-North America trade is at 60%, and Asia is at 51%. So Africa is at the lower end of intra-regional trade. Our trade continues, regrettably, to follow the colonial economic model of the past, exporting a very narrow range of primary commodities to countries of the north and importing manufactured goods. And as you know, this model ties Africa's fortunes to the volatility of global primary commodities markets, which is detrimental to the continent's economic development, as well as undermines its ambition to greater integration. In other words, we have to dismantle what I refer to as this colonial economic model which we inherited and which I'm the first one to admit that we sustained decade after decade, leading to contributing to our underdevelopment from an industrial point of view. What data tells us, therefore, is not pleasant, that Africa is increasingly being left behind by the rest of the world in virtually all aspects except poverty and despair, if you look at the percentages of people that are living below the poverty line. For too long, the character of Africa's continent has been this: smallness of national economies, a fragmented continental market, lack of economies of scale, a shallow productive capacity, and as I've just said earlier, a continued reliance on the export of primary commodities. It is therefore clear that going forward, Africa cannot be the raw material producing and exporting economy of the past if it is to achieve the economic transformation required for prosperity, to generate jobs for its very youthful population. Now, in recognition of these long-standing challenges, the African Union developed Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want, which was adopted by heads of states in January 2013 as Africa's blueprint and master plan towards the attainment of a Pan-African vision of an Africa that we desire. Agenda 2063 builds on and seeks to accelerate the implementation of past and existing initiatives on the African continent, which regrettably were never fully implemented, such as the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, as well as regional and national programs and plans. So the AfCFTA is identified and rests on Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. It is one of 15 flagship projects of Agenda 2063. It includes other economic development instruments, such as the Single African Air Transport Market, the free movement of persons, and the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. So what we've seen in the recent past is a recognition and a realization by us Africans that we cannot continue to be in this condition anymore, and that we have to integrate this market of 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars, which by the year 2030 is projected to be close to 7 trillion United States dollars in terms of consumer and business spending. Therefore, we have a very significant challenge to accelerate Africa's industrial development capacity, because we know from the experience of others around the world that industrialization is not a short journey, that it takes decade after decade of disciplined implementation of an industrial action plan, and that there is no shortcut to development. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a step, therefore, in this endeavor to rapidly transition from the vision of the founding mothers and fathers of the African Union to an integrated African market, which has the potential to position Africa for global competitiveness in 30 to 40 years' time from now. We know that industrialization is not a pill that you swallow and you wake up the next day you've industrialized. We know this from the experience of China, who succeeded to lift over 700 million people out of poverty in less than one generation. And so this vision of the Organization of African Unity being discharged by the Assembly of Heads of States and Government through the AfCFTA has the potential to take us a step closer to an integrated market. The founding mothers and fathers of the Organization of African Unity played their role. Their objective at that time, of course, was to completely defeat colonialism and unite politically the African continent, and I argue that they did with the demise of the apartheid regime in South Africa in 1994. But what has, for a very long time, evaded our continent is market integration and an integrated economy. This is now the challenge of our time. This is why the African Continental Free Trade Area is absolutely so critical. I am sure you will agree with me that the processes to negotiate, ratify, and operational such an ambitious agreement as the AfCFTA, and to do so in the middle of a pandemic, and to do so and have a fully operational trade agreement, a multi-jurisdictional trade agreement, fully operational in less than 5 years, is a tremendous success. And it speaks to the consciousness of our leaders on the African continent, consciousness to the challenge that I've just set out, that economic integration has evaded us for far too long. It also demonstrates the fact that we've been able to achieve consensus amongst very, very difficult economic issues, that we've been able to achieve consensus in less than 5 years. And we know that there are other fora around the world where consensus building has been very, very difficult. Now, this brings me to the first point to brief you on and provide an overview, and that is the state of play in the AfCFTA negotiations. We have recently concluded, or rather we have recently accepted the 39th instrument of ratification from the 39th state party. So out of 55 countries, we now have 39 state parties to the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. Only one country has not signed the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. And the fact that we have 39 countries demonstrates political will, demonstrates legal commitment to liberalization of intra-Africa trade, to liberalization of intra-African investment, and of course, it demonstrates Africa's commitment to being a favorable investment climate for all to benefit from. The countries that have not yet ratified are engaged in very necessary domestic consultations and legal processes. And obviously, it is a sovereign decision to enter into an international agreement, and we have to respect that. It is also a matter of domestic law that in different countries on the continent, the processes for ratifying an international agreement, they are very different and have different requirements. And therefore, I am not worried that we have 39 state parties to date. On the contrary, this is actually the fastest instrument to be ratified under the African Union since its establishment in the year 2000. As you may be aware, we have divided the negotiations in two phases. Phase one includes the protocol on trade in goods, trade in services, protocol on dispute settlement. We've concluded these protocols. We have also concluded about 87% on rules of origin, which too is remarkable. The fact that before, 55 countries had 55 local content requirements, 55 different local content requirements, 55 different rules for investing in each jurisdiction. We now have convergence on 87.8% of local content rules, covering a range of economically very, very important productive sectors of Africa's economy. And so we start trading on the basis of this 87.8% of convergence on rules of origin. Early next year, we will publish an AfCFTA tariff book, which will be transparent, and you will be, as an investor or an exporter or a manufacturer, you will be able to access this information digitally, and you will, with a degree of certainty and predictability, you will know what rule will apply to you in Nigeria, what rule will apply to you in Mali, in Malawi, in Kenya, and across the African continent. And rules of origin, of course, play a very important role, local content rules. The first is industrial development. The rules of origin are critical for ensuring that we foster industrialization on the African continent, that we don't import a shirt, put a button on it and say made in the AfCFTA. That's not industrialization. We don't want to create an environment where there is no industrialization that happens under a trade agreement in Africa, where we actually export the industrialization that we want to see in Africa. And so these rules of origin are very, very important, particularly in areas such as the automotive sector, textiles and clothing, and other labor-intensive areas of Africa's economy. We also have made significant progress in the area of trade in services. We have identified 5 priority sectors for immediate liberalization This is in the area, these services sectors are financial services, tourism services, transport services, communication services, and business services. And we will support this liberalization with a regulatory framework, a harmonized regulatory framework in these sectors of our, the services sector on the African continent. Once we have concluded the 5 priority sectors, we will quickly move on to negotiate liberalization in the remainder of the services sectors. More importantly, from an investment point of view, we also have operationalized the dispute settlement body. We now have a fully functional dispute settlement body. We looked at dispute settlement mechanisms around the world. We've looked at what works. We've looked at what does not work. We've looked at what kind of a dispute settlement mechanism is required to ensure that we engender and inject investor confidence in a trade agreement. There will always be trade disputes. Everybody knows that. There will always be investment, commercial disputes. The key question is, are they resolved impartially by a competent adjudicating body that has the requisite experience? And this is something that we have achieved. And I'm very proud that we have a dispute settlement mechanism that is forward-looking, that has learned from mistakes of other fora around the world. And I hope that this will provide further confidence to investors that yes, the African continent is open for business and investment, and is open for business and investment on the basis of rules that are transparent and that are applied evenly across the board. We are also making progress in what we call phase 2 issues. And phase 2, the protocols of phase 2 include intellectual property rights, investment protection, competition policy, digital trade, and women and youth in trade. I think what is critical, of course, is intellectual property rights. And the pandemic has put this to the fore. The fact that in 2019, Africa imported $16 billion worth of pharmaceutical products, very, very little manufacturing capacity of pharmaceutical products. And so we have to look to see how we can deploy an intellectual property rights regime that captures the reforms that we want to see, that provides and encourages investors, but at the same time, that is at the service of Africa's public health imperatives, that is at the service of Africa's industrial development imperatives. This is what intellectual property rights regime should be doing. We should have an intellectual property rights regime that enables African countries where there's a pandemic to produce these life-saving vaccines or other generic drugs, and we have to do so in a way that we responsibly put constraints on patents of right holders where there is a public health pandemic. It is more important to save lives than to make money when we're faced with a global pandemic, and the intellectual property rights regime of the AfCFTA will actually reflect that very, very important endeavor. Now, of course, there will be challenges. Of course, there will be difficulties. Of course, it's going to take time. And of course, some countries are in better stages of development and readiness than others. We know from the experience of Europe, which took 72 years today to be in the position where market integration in Europe, economic integration in Europe is at the depth that we see, which enables a number of advantages: a banking passport, free movement of persons across a monetary zone, a single currency, as we know. So we know that it is a difficult journey. We know that it takes time. We know that it's been 65 years in the making. Some may argue that we took too long, but we are where we are. And so we will confront these challenges. I will also add that implementing a trade agreement of 55 countries with differentials in levels of economic development will require that some countries who are ready, that they take the lead to implement the trade agreement, to liberalize investment and trade, and to move rapidly to full implementation of the AfCFTA. The biggest challenge that I see is in the area of differentials in levels of development. We know that there are some countries that have a GDP per capita of $110. On the other extreme, there are countries that have a GDP per capita of $25,000. And also we know that there are countries that already have an industrial base and an export capacity. And so we have to focus, as we implement this agreement, we have to focus on those countries that today do not have or may not have the industrial capacity to implement the agreement. And that is why we're partnering with the AfCFTA, with AfCFTA to establish an AfCFTA adjustment fund, which is a fund that will require about $8 billion over the next 6 to 10 years to mitigate this adjustment and to accommodate and address these differentials that I have just pointed to. AfCFTA has already made a contribution of $1 billion to start the fund. This $1 billion will form a base capital to mobilize resources that we will need to support the adjustment fund, to support countries that today may not have the industrial capacity. The AfCFTA adjustment fund is not going to be budget support. It is going to be directed strictly to productive sector investment in a range of different areas of countries' economies: agro-processing, the automotive sector, textiles and clothing, and other labor-intensive initiatives that are already ongoing in different countries. We will support implementation of this agreement through a number of tools. The adjustment fund is one of them. I've just mentioned it. We will also deploy the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System along with AfCFTA. As you know, we have 42 currencies on the African continent. The cost of currency convertibility is estimated to be at about $5 billion United States dollars annually. And this is a constraint on Africa's competitiveness, on access to trade, and it is, of course, a constraint and a barrier to small medium enterprises in Africa being able to trade across regions and across borders. Now, with this Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, a trader, a small medium enterprise, will be able to trade using local currency, to trade with a counterparty on another part, in another part of the African continent. They will receive their local currency, and we believe that this will improve ease of doing business, ease of doing trade, and of course will make our small medium enterprises more competitive. We're also working hard to ensure that we have established trade supporting infrastructure. Africa has a deficit, or an infrastructure deficit of close to $100 billion. I look at it as an opportunity to invest in hard infrastructure that will support trade so that in less than 15 years we can double intra-Africa trade. Lastly, let me focus on the significance of the opportunities that this agreement presents. According to a report by the World Bank, the AfCFTA represents a major opportunity for investment for countries around the world to consider investing in this new market to boost growth, reduce poverty, and broaden economic inclusion. Where implemented effectively, according to the World Bank, the AfCFTA has the potential to contribute to Africa's GDP up to $450 billion by the year 2035, accelerate wage growth, particularly for women in trade, and lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and 68 million Africans out of moderate poverty by the year 2035. The report further suggests that achieving these gains will be particularly important given the economic damage caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, estimated at around $80 billion in output losses in the year 2020 in Africa. Instructively, the report made a very encouraging observation, and that is that most of the AfCFTA's income gains are largely to come from measures that enhance ease of doing business and simplify customs procedures. The report notes that tariff liberalization accompanied by a reduction in non-tariff barriers, such as quotas and other trade restrictions, have the potential to boost income by 2.4% or about $150 billion. The remainder, which is $292 billion, will derive from trade facilitation measures that reduce red tape, lower compliance costs for investors and businesses engaged in trade, and make it easier for African businesses to integrate into global supply chains. Our long-term objective is that through the AfCFTA, African countries will be in a position to accelerate industrial development, create jobs for young people, and position our continent for global competitiveness in the way that 30, 40 years ago, nobody would have imagined that China today would be as globally competitive as they are. And so the AfCFTA is Africa's economic recovery tool post-COVID-19. Countries around the world have provided trillions and trillions of economic recovery tools, stimulus packages to re-inject growth and dynamism in their economies. Not many African countries have the monetary policy space, the fiscal policy space to provide such significant economic recovery tools. Therefore, Africa's economic recovery, accelerated economic recovery post-COVID-19 has to be aggressive implementation of this agreement, aggressive reduction of intra-Africa barriers to trade, investment, to ensure that trade becomes the driver of overall economic recovery as we move on from this pandemic. This agreement, in my view, provides an opportunity for US businesses and investors to invest in Africa, those who have not yet entered the market, and for those who are already in the market to expand their investments in line with the market access opportunities that this agreement provides. As I indicated before, the next wave of investments into the African market should be bold, transformative, and should focus on sectors that will define Africa's growth in the coming years. Of course, we cannot compel investors which sector they invest in, but we will encourage them to invest in AfCFTA markets and in particular to invest in productive sectors of Africa's economy. The AfCFTA, in my view, will unlock opportunities for investors. We have already, with the help of the MasterCard Foundation, have developed a private sector engagement strategy. We have identified, with the help of McKinsey & Company, we have identified priority value chains, pharmaceuticals, automotives, agro-processing, and financial technology as potential areas of immediate investment and establishment of value chain around the continent. Now let me conclude by observing that, again, we know that this is going to be difficult. We know that a trade agreement implemented by 55 countries is not going to be easy. As I mentioned earlier, we look to the experience of others, the mistakes of others, the successes of others in regional integration and in market integration. But I say this, that we would rather focus on what is it that we will not achieve if we do not implement this agreement rapidly. If we don't implement this agreement rapidly as Africans, and there is a commitment, a political commitment and a legal commitment to implement the agreement, the alternative is that we remain on the margins of global economic activity. We remain with smallness of national economies. We remain trapped in this colonial economic model of exporting primary commodities, and we remain with this 18% of intra-Africa trade fair. That is the alternative if we do not implement this trade agreement. And I believe that it is Africa's last opportunity to integrate our economy. I don't see that we will have another opportunity. I don't see the political will, this unprecedented political will. I do not see it coming back again. I certainly do not see the coming generations forgiving us for squandering an opportunity to improve the conditions of millions and millions of Africans and to place our continent on a path for global competitiveness in decades to come. So I want to thank you very much for the invitation, Woodrow Wilson Center, Brown Capital Management, for inviting me to share with you what our vision is for the African continent. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Wamkele, for that very straight, in-depth, to the point, raising of the status of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the update on where things stand, the challenges that you see on the road ahead, but also very powerfully the opportunities that you see for both the continent and international partners to be a part of this really historic and absolutely transformative initiative once fully implemented. So thank you for that. I'm sure there are lots of questions in the audience. So what I would like to do is to open it up to questions to the people in the auditorium, but also to our audience online. For those of you who are here in person, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I will acknowledge you and someone will bring a microphone to you. And once you get the mic, please tell us your name and the organization with which you are affiliated, if any, and then please ask your question. I will take a couple at a time and then give Mr. Mene an opportunity to respond before we go to another round. For those of you who are watching on the virtual webcast, you can submit your questions to the box that says submit a question. Please include your name and affiliation. Those questions will be sent to me and I will share them with Mr. Mene for his response. So with that, let me open up the floor to questions. I have a ton myself, but I really want to give the opportunity to our audience here. So if you have a question, all right, let me start with Ms. Banks right here in the front row. And then I'll go to Dr. Schneidman, and I think that is Dr. Putman, and then I'll come to Mr. Carroll. So take the first two, and then the next two. Okay. All right.
Thank you,
Ms. Banks.
Good morning. Excellency, Secretary General Wamkele, pleasure to be here. Really appreciated listening to your lecture, very frank, very open. And I guess my question is probably a question a lot of people in the room and perhaps online have as well. But oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Dana Banks, Senior Director for Africa, Special Assistant to the President at the National Security Council. Heard your comments as well about sort of the ability to be able to, for the African continent and for countries to be able to practice trade freely in light of the travel restrictions. So I just want to acknowledge that at first. But general question, how can the U.S. government, how can I know there's private sector in the room, but I'm asking from the government's perspective, how can we best support the AfCFTA? What mechanisms would be most useful to you? And how can we also support our American private sector to increase investment with the African continent? As you know, you're probably well aware of the Prosper Africa initiative that we relaunched earlier this year, and we really want to see that as a partner, as a tool to help provide greater support to African investors, but also building back better both at home and abroad. And so we really want to support the AfCFTA because this agreement is what the continent has said that they wanted, so we want to do our best to support you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you get the mic to Dr. Schneidman, just in the middle over there?
Thank you very much, Monday, for convening us, and Mr. Brown for sponsoring us. Mr. Secretary General, welcome to the United States. We're honored that this is your first official visit. It means a great deal. And I'm Whitney Schneidman, and I'm Senior Advisor for Africa at Covington and Burling. And I'm also on the advisory board of the African Center here at the Wilson Center. My question is this, and you and I have sort of discussed this here and there, and I'm concerned, just sort of building on the previous question from Dana, about the movement of goods and services across the continent. You know, it's known that it takes, you know, the 1,500 kilometers from Cape Town to Johannesburg, it takes a truck 17 hours. It takes that same truck 5 days to go the 1,500 kilometers from Johannesburg to Lusaka. And when I had the honor to visit the Secretariat in Accra in October, I was very impressed by the work that they were doing on the Abidjan-Lagos road. And I'm just curious if you had thought about something like a strategic corridors initiative that your partners could work with you on, where you take the 10 most critical roads and really drill down to make sure that goods and services can just move much more quickly within, I don't know, 12 months or 18 months. Yeah. So just that kind of question. Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much, Ms. Banks, Dr. Schneidman. So 2 questions for you, Mr. Mene. One, how can the U.S. be most supportive to the efforts that the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Area are trying to implement or implementing right now? And secondly, resolving this transportation dilemma and its impact on trade and potentially looking into strategic transport corridors. Yeah. So over to you.
Yeah.
You can remain seated if you'd like.
Okay.
You're also welcome there.
The next one I'll take seated.
All right, sure.
Thank you very much for the questions and the comments. First, let me just say that we are interested, and myself in particular as an elected officer of the AU, are very much interested in maintaining a mutually beneficial partnership with partners around the world. What I described to an ambassador from a country that I will not mention is that we want a mutually respectful partnership. The days when we can be told what to do, how to do it, are gone. And those were not happy days to begin with. And so I said to this ambassador, as Africans, we are now in a new mindset. We want to work in a cooperative arrangement, particularly in respect of trade and investment. And I said to her that there is only one person who tells me what to do and I do it, who is not African, and that is my wife. And that's because I don't have a choice. I have to do what she tells me to do. But from a point of view of structuring a trade and investment relationship, the starting point has to be mutually respectful. And that's why I was very encouraged with the meeting that we had yesterday with Ambassador Tai and her team, where we identified areas of mutual collaboration, women and youth in trade. We discussed in detail from a point of view of a trade agreement being inclusive, that this is an important area for us to work on together. Digital trade is also an important area, particularly in light of the pandemic and the fact that now digital trade is really at the fore of global commerce, having gone through a devastating pandemic. Trade facilitation, there are some areas that we can collaborate on, that we can find common ground on. Investment facilitation, we would like to see more US companies investing in the AfCFTA market. We want to see more US investors benefiting from this market of 1.3 billion people, those who are not yet there, and of course those who are there to expand their investments. And so investment facilitation and cooperation is also another very important area that we look forward to working on together. I take your point on the travel restrictions, and I welcome I would urge that the administration should rethink its position. I certainly expected something like that from those who called us shithole countries. I didn't expect it from our friends today. Now, regarding the trade facilitation that Dr. Whitney asked, massive challenge. That's why we have in the AfCFTA a protocol on transit, customs procedures, and trade facilitations. These instruments, the intention is to streamline and harmonize across the board, across all African countries, to harmonize customs procedures and transit procedures. In the corridor, or let me say first that most of our trade corridors on the continent, there's quite a lot of improvement and enhancing competitiveness to be done. Most of our corridors the infrastructure may be there, but from a customs and transit point of view, we have quite a lot of work to do in the implementation of the AfCFTA. We did a study, and we found that to transit goods from Abidjan to Lagos, 1,200 kilometers, it takes between 10 and 12 days. And there are 37 checkpoints along the way. Other corridors, and we will get to other corridors also, other corridors have similar challenges in terms of trade facilitation. And so we are working with Trademark East Africa. We are working with African Development Bank and Afrexim Bank to do two things really. First, to see how we can mobilize private sector investment in along the corridors. And there is already a model that we are looking at. Afrexim Bank invested over $70 million in improving infrastructure on the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe and Bight Bridge. And that's a type of a model that we are looking at. How do we make sure that in trade facilitation, we better involve the private sector? I have met with private sector across the African continent, and this is the number one concern that they have, transit of goods. And so we have to, the second thing that we have to do is to make sure that our customs officers have a better understanding of the AfCFTA and its obligations. Since I have been in Accra, in the year that I've been in Accra, we have hosted 4 times. We have brought customs authorities to Accra, where we discuss the challenges of transit, customs procedures, and trade facilitation, and we will continue to have that dialogue. We want our corridors to be competitive, not to compete against one another, but to be competitive. If you look at the success story of the East African community, previously, a distance of 1,600 kilometers from Port of Mombasa to Kampala in Uganda, it would take about 9-10 days. Today, it takes 3 days. That is because of the interventions that have been made in infrastructure development, soft and hard infrastructure. These interventions have been very, very successful in reducing transit time and in making the East African community, that trade corridor, quite competitive. Of course, there will be challenges that will always be there. But from the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, it's absolutely critical that we make specific interventions to improve its competitiveness. That is why we convened ministers of trade in Lomé in September from these countries, as well as ECOWAS and customs authorities, because we want to make sure that all our corridors are competitive. And that's, again, an opportunity for investors to work with us in building the competitiveness of our trade corridors. The trade corridor that we are talking about is critical to Mali, Burkina Faso, to Niger, because they rely on the countries that have ports for transit of their goods to Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. And so to the extent that we can reduce the time it takes for goods to transit, it is enabling the economies of these landlocked countries. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Did you, please, and then I'll come to Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Diana Putman from USAID. I'm actually filling in the position that Dr. Munyangwa is supposed to take once she eventually gets confirmed. It was really nice to listen to a young African leader with the level of enthusiasm that you have, Mr. Mene. What I would like to hear a little bit more about is how do we accelerate the change, the pace of change that is going to be required? I look around the room, there's people here that I know have been working on trade and investment issues for a couple of decades on the continent, myself included. I love the fact that you actually gave the example of the Mombasa to Kampala corridor, because the East Africa mission of USAID was probably the first donor that really started working on that over 20 years ago through COMESA and then the EAC. And we got that change, but that took 20 years. And so I guess I'm curious to know what everyone can do to accelerate the pace of change, particularly because in a lot of countries we have the very same leaders who have been espousing that they want to see free trade on the continent for years and years and years, and yet when it comes to taking the actual steps required to make this dream a reality that we're all working on so hard, what are some of those next steps you might offer?
All right. Thank you. To pass it to Mr. Carroll.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you for your remarks, and I've been following your career for the last year. Congratulations on your successes in putting this into focus. I have been following, I'm an investor, Tony Carroll. I'm on the Africa Advisory Board here with Whitney Schneidman and others in this room. I'm an investor in Africa, founded a private equity fund that's invested in telecommunications and now financial services. I'm also a philanthropist on the board of something called Global Hope. We operate pediatric cancer facilities in 7 countries and have just launched a program at your alma mater at Red Cross Hospital to train pediatric oncologists and hematologists. One of the issues that we challenge among our 7 countries we operate is getting products across borders. Chemo products, flow spectrometers, sequencing machines, which you mentioned in Botswana, where I used to live as a Peace Corps volunteer years ago. And it's not so easy. And so I'm wondering if concomitant to this notion of an African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we're making progress on reducing the barriers in enhancing the trade of pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, and therapeutics across borders, because if each of the 45 sub-Saharan African countries have to validate and authorize for efficacy and safety each individual product, it's going to delay that trade, even if they're made next door. So I think there has to be a concomitant effort to try to remove barriers on the trade of these essential products, essential health products, to implement the vision that you have.
All right, so two more really good questions. I think Dr. Putnam's question adds on to Ms. Banks' question, which is really what can we do to facilitate, enhance the work that you're doing to bring about this transformation. And then the second one about the challenges of essential health, of transporting and moving essential health products across borders and getting them to the people who need them. What can be done there?
Yeah, again, thank you for the questions. I think that the big difference that I see now is we have a trade agreement that has clear rules that are binding to open borders. That is actually a major accelerator that we did not have for the last 65, 70 years. And so this tool, this trade instrument, I think is a remarkable opportunity as an accelerator. So we, and as I said, we should not squander it. We are making, in terms of next steps, for example, on this issue of corridors, we are mobilizing our development finance institutions to invest in the trade corridors. We are mobilizing our commercial banks to invest in the trade corridors so that the toll gates out of the border, that the roads, that the private sector has an opportunity to invest and run those facilities. I was very encouraged when I was in Nigeria and the Nigerian authorities said to me, we're not interested in running a road. Why is it that we cannot bring in the private sector to manage these trade corridors and we do it jointly? So I'm encouraged by the fact that we now have a different instrument, which rather a new instrument, which will be an accelerator. I think what will be helpful is if the AfCFTA Secretariat and USAID sit together and identify areas where we can work together in a structured way. I'm happy that it is news that you will be moving, so we can have that conversation about how the US can support implementation of this agreement in a way that is really mutually beneficial. And so that, I think, is an important next step, is for us to convene ourselves and identify areas where we can work together from a development standpoint. From a policy standpoint, we had a very good conversation yesterday with Ambassador Tai, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The transiting of goods across borders, particularly goods that are critical for fighting not only this pandemic, but also for ensuring that Africans have access to world-class public health, medication, and therapeutics that they need, is important. What we saw is that last year, there were 42 countries that in Africa that were either in a full lockdown or a partial lockdown. Borders were closed, and germ-killing products could not transit. Personal protection equipment could not transit. And so I think what we should do going forward, and this is something that I will put to the Ministers of Trade, is establishing trade corridors for these products that are required to fight pandemics for public health. So that even if we have another pandemic at this scale or a larger scale that causes border closures, that even where there are those border closures, pharmaceutical products can still transit and people can still have access to all of these germ-killing products the personal protection equipment. They were, at the time when, at the start of the pandemic, there were millions and millions of masks, ventilators that were donated but couldn't transit through borders because the borders were closed. And so we have to find and establish these trade corridors that will be critical for ensuring smooth transit of these goods, even in the middle of pandemics. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make sure I'm not missing any questions from the online audience. Catherine, where are you? Do we have any? Oh, I don't see them on my phone. Do you mind? Sorry. All right. I want to make sure that our online audience feels included. In the meantime, I see the Ambassador, did you have a comment to make? And then I'll take the lady in the back there. You're okay. So I'll take the lady over here, and I can't see your name, I'm sorry. I'll take the gentleman over here, and then I'll take a couple of questions from the audience. If you don't mind, since we're coming to the end, I'll take all of those, and maybe you can comment very quickly on some of them. Mr. Brown? Okay, all right.
Good, by now, maybe afternoon, I'm not sure, but Dr. and Secretary General, thank you so much for, one, framing the conversation, two, for being so straightforward. It's been my experience that when people are straightforward, they actually have something to say. So I really appreciate it, and we'll try to follow suit. I'm Deirdre Henry Spires from the Small Business Administration. I'm Senior Advisor to our Administrator, Isabel Casillas Guzman. And so I was appreciating your conversation, but it was a brief mention of the small to medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs. And, you know, what we found here is that over 90% of our exporters are small businesses, but only 1% of small businesses actually export. So I think I have a question, and then also pointing to an opportunity. I'm wondering what the development of your small and medium-sized firms is looking like, and how you're thinking about that infrastructure. We found during the pandemic, the boss coined a phrase, accidental exporters, that because of the digital market exploding, our small businesses found that even though they had no exporting plans, they became exporters. So I just want to point to that as a place of consideration, and hear your thinking on building the infrastructure for your small businesses. And then I want to point to one more opportunity. Yeah, I promise, very briefly. At Small Business, we've been thinking about the diaspora. And so I think there is some real opportunity to have a conversation around the 39 ratifying countries, the diaspora that's here in the United States, and opportunities for trade between the two. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you get the microphone to this gentleman over here, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Jason Small, Manager Africa Programs at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And as you may know, sir, that the MCC has been investing in Africa now for more than 15 years. We've been up to about $10 billion in grants that we've done across the continent. And we have got about $3 billion or more right now in infrastructure projects, primarily, particularly to try to reduce poverty through economic growth, and that's our mission. We've been very, very proud of what we've accomplished there. One of the unique things about MCC as an aid institution, as part of the U.S. government, is that we invest in countries that are relatively well governed. We have a scorecard that we use to evaluate countries each year, and in fact, our board of directors is meeting today to look at the scorecards and to make selections for our country partners going into next year. And one of the things I'm very interested to hear about you, and our focus is on governance and on that as a threat to the implementation and the future of the free trade area, and also insecurity. Those two issues, as we look at where we can implement our programs, including our new regional compacts that we are looking to implement, that Congress gave us authority to do a few years ago. Those are continual challenges that we are facing and where we can operate, security and a declining governance. So if you could address that, it would be great. But thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we're coming at you with a whole lot of questions, and there are a couple that I really want to get in because they're from some of our African youth on the continent. One has to do with if you could speak in more detail as to how the African Continental Free Trade Area can be used as a basis for achieving Agenda 2063. I think you spoke to it, but I think if you can touch on the youth dimension of it. You talked about women and youth and the strategies that maybe you're thinking about of achieving those. The other one is from Inanna Shanom. I hope I got that correct. It seems that the African Continental Free Trade Area's dispute mechanisms have been modeled after the World Trade Organizations. So somebody's tying your remarks back to your previous job. And given those issues, how will the African Continental Free Trade Area get African states to trust the dispute resolution mechanism? So that's one point. So those are the two questions I was going to put there. So obviously we're throwing a lot at you, and I apologize to our AV team. This is a really important discussion, so please, with your permission, if I can just get 5 extra minutes so the Secretary General can speak to the questions that we have asked him. So over to you, Mr. Mene.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the questions. When I critique trade agreements and why trade agreements do not succeed most of the times, and why there was an individual who was able to say trade agreements benefit only the elite, they export jobs to Mexico and so on, is as much as I hate to admit it, to an extent he was right. Of course, it's a very unsophisticated analysis, but it has electoral appeal, as we've seen. But the point is, if you have a trade agreement that lacks inclusivity, it's not going to succeed, particularly in the context of Africa, where we have almost 60% of Africa's GDP is derived from small, medium enterprises, creating over 450 million jobs. And most of these small, medium enterprises are led by women. Yeah. And so in recognition of this fact, I have been talking to CEOs of commercial banks in Africa to say, can we create a multilateral trade finance facility that will benefit primarily small, medium enterprises that are run by women and young people. And the reactions have been very, very positive. One a CEO of a big bank said to me that their trade finance portfolio is very, very successful, and it focuses on women, small, medium enterprises. They have 100% repayment of their debts, and that's because, of course, women don't go and buy whiskey on Friday night. They pay back their loans, and it's a very successful business for them. But what we are working at is how can we multilateralize this? How can we roll this out through the rest of the continent? And so we are working with commercial banks, with Afreximbank, African Development Bank, to see how we can structure a trade finance facility that will broaden access to small, medium enterprises. When I was in Malawi, I met with a young woman who has an agro-processing business. She exports orange juices, and a very, very successful business in Malawi and in Southern Africa. She wants to expand her business to West Africa, East Africa, and North Africa. But she needs capital for that. And so for me, these are the types of businesses that this trade finance facility would be making interventions to help them to make use of the AfCFTA. Because if it benefits, as I've said in the past, if it benefits only the large corporations, it's not going to succeed. And the results will be rejection by Africans. And then the last point I would make on small, medium enterprises, we are now in the last stages of developing a digital app called Africa Trade Gateway. And this digital app is primarily, again, for small, medium enterprises. There will be due diligence information about your counterparty. There will be market intelligence about the market that you want to export to. There will be a payments platform. The payments platform that I referred to will be there. Customs procedures, single window for customs procedures. And then you will now be able to interconnect as a small medium enterprise with other small medium enterprises through this platform. It's a very, very important area for me, and it's a very, very important priority because I don't want this agreement to be perceived to be an agreement that benefits only the large corporations. I'm not saying they should not benefit, they should, but we must take all segments of society along with us as we implement the agreement. On the diaspora, I think it's important because we need the expertise of the diaspora, we need the capital, access to capital. We are already in conversations with Ambassador Bennett, who is a retired ambassador, is in Ghana and is working to organize and mobilize the diaspora. The question from our colleague from Mr. Small from MCC, yes, of course, there is a clear correlation between good governance and trade, open trade. There is clearly a correlation between trade and insecurity where it happens. And we know that the people that suffer the most are the informal traders along the borders who are mainly women who are trading their goods across where there is insecurity. This presents a barrier to their ability and their right to trade across borders. And that's why the African Union has taken a very, very firm stance in countries where there have been coups d'etats, very, very clear, very firm condemnation by the African Union, by our leaders, that this is intolerable. Also, President Akufo-Addo of Ghana has been equally, as chairman of ECOWAS, has been equally very, very clear that this shall not be tolerated. From the point of view of trade, it is incredibly disruptive, and it's incredibly disruptive to investment and trade. But it is something that, as I say, there is clarity on by the leadership of the African Union. The young people are critical in the implementation of this agreement. We just hosted a trade fair in South Africa, an intra-Africa trade fair. The overwhelming majority of attendees and exhibitioners were young people, young entrepreneurs. We also had a Youth Connect Summit in Ghana, where we are looking to see how we can match young entrepreneurs with investment opportunities, with market access opportunities across the African continent. Because trade agreements are not about the past. Trade agreements are about the future. And so we've got to make sure that as we implement this agreement and as we look to the future of the continent, young people are at the fore of that. We are developing a program on youth inclusion in the AfCFTA, and we will roll it out early next year. On dispute settlement, just the last point, I thought I should respond to this. We looked at why the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO didn't work, why some members were unhappy, and we made some technical changes to how it is structured at the WTO. I believe it will work. The system will gain trust if we have competent, impartial, technically sound adjudicators. We have to have the brightest and the best lawyers who are in the dispute settlement mechanism. Otherwise, it's going to fail, and investors will lose confidence in it, and that's not what we want. And so far, we are off to a very, very good start, and we are going to drive it to continue to be a successful dispute settlement mechanism. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Mene, thank you so much. What a fantastic way to get us started with the second phase of Brown Capital Management Africa Forum relationship. I could not have asked, or rather I should be saying we could not have asked for a better speaker to just really get us to the heart of one of the key developments on the African continent, the potential that it has, and how Africa and the United States and other partners could engage to really breathe full life into the efforts that you are undertaking with the Secretariat and all of the other leaders who have committed to this. So I know we're a little bit behind time, but let me just say this. A number of key messages that we're taking away from here. I want you to be sure that you know that we heard you. And I think Ms. Banks and others have already said that they have heard you. They're taking some messages back. But 3 or 4 really quick messages that I'm taking away from here. One is about how the stubborn negative perceptions and stereotypes of Africa are getting in the way of the development agenda and of mutually beneficial relations between the United States and Africa. And a key part of that has also to do with what the media chooses to portray or highlight about Africa. And so maybe I heard you call for a more nuanced and accurate, truthful reflection of Africa that reflects both those challenges and the negatives. Mm-hmm. The second comment that I heard you, that I'm taking away, is on the COVID response, mostly driven by Western countries, that seems to be doing 3 things. 1, punishing African countries that have come up pointed out this new variant instead of rewarding them. Hindering Africa's trade and development in a context in which the continent was already struggling in parts, and so this has just made it worse. But I think you raised a point about revisiting the extent to which the COVID response, or the response to COVID, is scientifically driven, but also equally applied. And just really trying to manage the pandemic while ensuring that we do not shut down or cause further damage to some of these recovery efforts that are going on across the continent. And then your other point was about US-Africa relations matters. They are valued, but I think we all got your point that there is some repair work to be done on that front. The important thing about the status of the African Continental Free Trade area is that the agreement has been ratified by 39 countries. It was reassuring for us to hear that you do not have any fundamental concerns about the 16 that are yet to ratify, that is really an issue of them navigating domestic politics, getting their parliaments to review and get through all of that. So that is reassuring. We're definitely on the right track on that. But I also heard from Ms. Banks and several others here about perhaps the African Continental Free Trade Secretariat getting together to really look at what the US also has to offer. The Prosper Africa, which is something that came up under the Trump administration, the Build Back Better that the Biden administration is pulling together, and really explore in depth what the opportunities are to really engage with the infrastructures that exist here and what you are trying to do on the continent, that there's some opportunities there that we can really sink our teeth into. Not to mention that AGOA expires in 2025. And so there is work to be done that on re-envisioning US-Africa economic engagement and what it might look like. And I think what I heard from everybody in this room is they're giving you on the trade side an opportunity to engage with them, to really talk about what that might look like. And so I think that was an invitation that we hope you're going to take advantage of. And then just the steps that have been taken. So we're reassured, we hear the progress that you shared with us on the rules of origin, on the dispute settlement mechanisms, the transit and customs procedures that you're working through, the intellectual property rights and the women and youth issues that you'll be dealing with in phase 2. And so we thank you for all of that. We know it's not an easy job. You are in an absolutely critical job, but we know it's not an easy job. And so as I ask the audience, both virtual and here, to please just join me in thanking you for the work that you are doing. We want nothing but success for you. And I hope what you're taking from here is the willingness of people sitting in this room, heading up various U.S. agencies, to engage in a dialogue with you about how we can together move forward. And so with that, let me thank you once again, truly, for taking the time to come and join us here today. I know this was a difficult trip for you. You have many demands on your time. And the fact that you made this your first official trip here and you have engaged with us, and it speaks volumes about your commitment to the work that you are doing. Not necessarily on behalf of government. I always like to think of it on behalf of ordinary African people across that continent. So we are cheering for you to succeed. We are cheering for you to succeed. And so thank you for the lecture. We look forward to staying in touch with you and to engaging and figuring out what ways we can work with you to support the work that you are doing. To you, the audience, both here and online, thank you so much for engaging with Mr. Mene, your insightful questions, your comments, speaking to the very heart of the issues that underpin U.S.-Africa economic relations, but also, I think, demonstrate the U.S. government's desire to work with you on this development and trade part of the work that you are doing. Brown capital management, I hope you are taking away from, we're taking away from this, just a fantastic start to these key issues. Your support enables us to shine the spotlight on these fundamental, important, and critical issues, both to the continent and to U.S.-Africa relations. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Wilson Center team, the Africa Program team, AV, and the facilities and logistics teams. And then finally to you, Ambassador Suka Mafudzi. I cannot thank you enough for the work that you do here in Washington to push the Africa agenda and to work with all of us. And so with that, our program for today is concluded, but a huge thank you to you, sir. Absolutely. Thank you.